Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in today's video, we are looking at Romanticism, which is a cultural and literary movement that spanned roughly the mid-18th century through the early 19th century. Out of all the literary movements, I suppose that Romanticism is probably one of the most well-known amongst the general public, even those who don't study literature, and largely, I suspect, because of a certain video by Elaine de Botton's The School of Life, which posits that Romanticism was largely responsible for popularizing the notion that marriage should be based on romantic love rather than social practicalities. Now, whether or not you agree with that is probably the topic for another video. That said, Romanticism is about much more than just love and romance, and in fact, these concepts play a pretty minor role in the concept as we understand it as a literary movement. Romanticism is a sprawling, complex movement that would actually take much more than just a short video like this to do justice. But as a helpful entry point to understand literary Romanticism, we can break it down into three overarching ideas, which I'll go on to explore in this video. Romanticism placed a premium on the individual self over the collective whole. It prioritized the imagination and emotions over reason and logic. It preferred nature and purity as subject matters over machinery and artifice. But before we move on, it's important for us to take a step back and to look at the context of Romanticism. So to best understand Romanticism, we have to look at it as a movement which came after what we call the Age of Enlightenment. Now, the easiest way to think about Romanticism is as a watershed movement that was sandwiched between three revolutions. You have the Enlightenment, which was a period when ideas such as reason, empiricism, and science gained a lot of intellectual credence as it emerged with the rise of the scientific revolution in the mid-17th century, best marked by the 1687 publication of Newton's Principia Mathematica, in which he puts forth the groundbreaking laws of motion and gravity that would come to revolutionize the way people viewed the world. Romanticism also evolved with the Industrial Revolution that came about in the mid-18th century, when the Western world began to establish itself on capitalist structures like mass production and international trade. So Romanticism is essentially a reaction against the excesses of these two scientific and economic revolutions, and it was sparked off by the much more violent political revolution, which was of course the French Revolution. Now, with the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, intellectuals, artists, and poets began to challenge this idea that science, reason, and industry were the blanket solutions to all human problems, which, up until that point, was very much the public perception. After all, there's always too much of a good thing, and so it seemed like too much emphasis on science led people to ignore their spiritual and emotional needs. Too much reason encouraged utilitarian and callous exploitation of people, especially towards the marginalized and the poor. Too much industry resulted in the large-scale destruction of nature and of the environment. Adding to these problems, political corruption and social destitution were rampant across France and Britain. Most strikingly, these problems were portrayed in William Blake's poem London and also Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. So it seemed then that whatever Enlightenment values previously deemed infallible now seemed to fall short of their promises in elevating the human condition. Now, this led to a general crisis in faith and provided fertile conditions for a new, different zeitgeist to take root, hence the rise of Romanticism. Now, a good poem to read for an understanding of the Romantic context is William Wordsworth's The World is Too Much With Us, which captures this sense of disillusionment that the poet felt about the ills of mass industrialization and the general spiritual impoverishment amongst the masses, specifically in the way that people abused and exploited nature for their greedy and materialistic ends. Now, where literary Romanticism was concerned, there was a shift from coterie writing, highbrow neoclassicism and satire to a more sincere register and layman subject matters, as poets used simpler language, which were words of Anglo-Saxon root rather than Latin inflections. And they also wrote about topics that resonated with common people, such as the plight of the impoverished, the beauty of nature, etc. Lyric poetry forms like odes and ballads also became popular, as they were ideal for crystallizing individual feelings and thoughts in sharp, vivid imagery, which dramatic and epic poems weren't as well suited to do. There are many, many important concepts related to literary romanticism, but of course, given the scope of this video, I've selected 5 that I think you should all know as a solid starting point if you're starting to understand literary movements and romanticism. So let's go through them in the rest of this video right now. Now, I want you guys to take a look at the following 2 images. How would you describe each of them? Go ahead and pause the video and write down some descriptive words that you would use to describe each of these images. The one I'm showing right now is probably what we would consider to be a pleasant, idyllic landscape. It's a picture of pastoral beauty. But the one I'm now showing here, also certainly a scene of beauty, contains a sort of grandeur that far exceeds mere beauty, because it inspires awe, but also carries this hint of terror. Just imagine being in that environment. The incredible altitude of the summit, the absolute singularity of the mountain, the sharp jaggedness of the terrain, all of this combine to inspire a mix of awe and terror in the viewer. Now, this mixture of awe and terror is what the Romantics called the Sublime, which is that sensation when you witness and experience a moment that attests to the mysterious power of nature, and it takes your breath away because nature amazes and frightens you at the same time. A good formulation of this idea comes from Edmund Burke, the 18th century political philosopher, and he summarized the concept of sublimity in an apt oxymoron: delightful terror. He states, "Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. The passion caused by the great and the sublime in nature, when those causes operate most powerfully, is astonishment. And astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its emotions are suspended with some degree of horror." In romantic poetry and novels, especially Gothic novels, there's often this sense of sublimity in the setting and environments that the writers portray. For example, Wordsworth's speaker in the prelude observes at one point, quote, "The horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct upreared its head." And then we have Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein reflecting on the overpowering emotions he feels when he witnesses the summit of Glacier Montanfert, when he says, "Its tremendous and ever-moving glacier filled me with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul and allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always the effect of solemnizing my mind and causing me to forget the passing cares of life." Now, what does the sublimity of nature do? It reminds us of our relative powerlessness, and in turn of the need for humans to recognize their place in the grand scheme of the universe. And in the face of nature's wonderful majesty, no social institution or cultural achievement can measure up. So the sublime is, in a way, an incredibly humbling concept. By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. The Byronic hero was named after Lord Byron, who was famously both a great poet and a great womanizer. The Byronic hero is best understood as this sort of bad boy archetype, the type of boy who's prone to bouts of wild mood swings, but is also incredibly seductive, alluring, and charming for being just so cray-cray. Basically, he's the hot dude who you know is bad news, but can't help falling for anyway. There's a sense of mystique and danger that surrounds this character, which is fantastic for narrative development, actually, because readers are egged on by the suspense and mystique of this character to discover more about the motives and secrets that the Byronic hero seems to be hiding. The original Byronic hero is the speaker in Lord Byron's narrative poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is a semi-autobiographical account of a melancholic young man who's disillusioned with the cold and cruel ways of the world as he travels throughout continental Europe and reflects on the destruction and tragedies caused by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The speaker's voice in this poem is indignant and impassioned, while the loftiness and idealism of his concerns make him all the more attractive and smouldering a character. Now here's a taste of what he sounds like. There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes, by the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man the less, but nature more. From these are interviews, in which I steal from all I may be, or have been before, to mingle with the universe, and feel what I can never express, yet cannot or conceal. So as you can tell, there's an oratorical stateliness in the anaphoric sequence of there is a pleasure, there is a rapture, there is society. While the sweeping categorical statements of I love not man the less, but nature more, and to mingle with the universe describes an elevatedness to the speaker that positions him above common humanity. But we also see a tension between the speaker's awareness of his inevitability and his yearning for expression in the final line of feel what I can never express, yet cannot or conceal. And this sort of awareness of wanting to say something and yet cannot quite describe it is also tied very much to the notion of sublimity. In fiction, a classic example of the Byronic hero would be Rochester in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, whose mysterious first marriage and complicated past makes him a figure of alluring intrigue. Also, notice the conceptual similarities between the Byronic hero and the Sublime, which we just discussed, because both of these ideas inspire polarizing emotions of awe and fear, whether it be a character or a landscape. And this sort of chasm makes sense given the fracturedness of the times, but most importantly, it captures a fundamental tension at the heart of the romantic psyche, which is the desire to reconcile messy contradictions and the need to recognize that there are certain contradictions which can never be explained, which segues nicely into our third concept. Now, strictly speaking, negative capability isn't really a theory or a distinct concept. It was just a somewhat obscure phrase that John Keats, the poet, had used in one of his letters to his brothers. The idea of negative capability is actually quite simple, and there's nothing really negative about it in the derogatory sense. Negative capability simply means being okay with not knowing, being at peace with uncertainties and ambiguities about not really having a definite answer to everything in the world. In fact, this state of not knowing is what Keats believes makes writing and reading poetry such a wonderful experience, as we can see in the final line to his poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. And these are actually some of my favourite lines in poetry ever. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth, and all you need to know. The irony here is that while Keats uses the word truth, he's implying that truth doesn't really ever exist. And to pine after any kind of truth is to miss the point of poetry, which is beauty. And beauty is a concept that is sufficient in and of itself. So for a thing to be beautiful is reason enough for it to exist. No explanation, justification, or, God forbid, evidence is necessary. And equally, because we can never know all there is to know, we must be content with knowing just enough and of bumping against this point of unknowing, and be happily resigned to the notion that we simply cannot know everything about the world, and be comfortable with this recognition that human rationality has its limits and that nature has its own inscrutable, magical ways that we can never explain. The contextual influence of this idea is clear, specifically in the fact that, as you remember, Romanticism was a reaction against the Enlightenment conviction in this supremacy of reason. This is also why romantic poetry often features language and ideas that could sometimes appear quite vague, fluffy, and imprecise. But rather than seeing this as a stylistic flaw, we could actually interpret the Romantics' linguistic ambiguity as a sign that they were comfortable with not having to nail down every single granularity about the world, because at the heart of their philosophy was an acknowledgement of the boundaries of human knowledge and knowability about forces that were much greater than ourselves, whether this be nature or God. What does it mean to call someone a genius? Nowadays, when we say someone is a genius, we tend to mean that they are extraordinarily intelligent or gifted. But to the Romantics, genius had more to do with creative genesis, which they believe stems from the individual imagination. Creativity to the Romantics originates in a person's mind, and it is an untainted essence that has not been influenced by any sort of external knowledge. Whereas pre-Romantic era writing would often be works of collective effort, for example, those literary salons in the Augustan era that produced metaphysical poetry, or it could be a product of multiple sources. For example, think about Shakespeare referencing numerous classical and continental texts for the plot of his plays. The Romantics, though, saw the individual mind as the original and sometimes only wellspring of creativity. But of course, in execution, they would also often reference a lot of classical and past works. The origins of creative genius can be traced back to Cicero's term afflatus, which loosely translates into divine inspiration. But the Romantic idea of genius lends the poet a much greater degree of agency. Instead of seeing poets as these passive receptacles of sudden flashes of inspiration from God, they apotheosized poets as these visionaries, and saw the poet's vocation as one that was analogous to priesthood. This partly explains why so much of Romantic poetry is autobiographical, introspective, and concerned very much with the self, and why the line between the speaker and the author is so often blurred. Because to the Romantics, the locus of creativity always ultimately rested with the living and breathing individual, which could often only mean the author, him or herself. Simply put, Pantheism is the idea that God manifests in all things. Rather than the traditional Christian belief of God as the creator of everything, Pantheism takes away that hierarchy and conflates God with all matter in the world. Just as we can never fathom the truth about God and must therefore rely on blind faith, so we must not try to rationalize the mysterious ways in which nature works, remember? So the faith with which the Romantics invested in nature is very much similar to the sort of religious fervor often demonstrated by devout believers. And while pantheism isn't an idea that originated in the Romantic era, it is certainly prevalent in many Romantic works, as we can see from the way poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge would often imbue their descriptions of nature with these divine spiritual characteristics. Indeed, nature is sometimes personified in Romantic poetry as God. If we go back to Wordsworth's "The World is Too Much With Us" poem that I introduced earlier in this video, we'll notice that the capitalized nature is implied to be the great God alluded to halfway through the poem. Like God in Christ, nature is presented as this eternally generous, sacrificial, and all-encompassing figure who gives us his everything, including the sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and yet is so spurned and abused by these ungrateful humans. There's also the sense that we are not worthy of nature's greatness and largesse, which is not unlike the Christian sentiment that man is forever indebted to God's generosity, forgiveness, and goodwill. So by seeing divinity in nature, the Romantics make a sort of pagan religion out of the natural world, and by extension, they transform themselves into these ministers of a new saintly order, as in Shelley's famous pronouncement, these great unacknowledged legislators of the world. And that's it for this video, guys. I hope this has given you a clear, solid overview of Romanticism and some of its key ideas. I'll be following this up with a series of literary movement videos, so make sure that you subscribe and hit that bell notification icon below if you haven't done so already, so that you don't miss the videos when they come out. As always, if you found this video helpful in leveling up your literary understanding, please do hit the thumbs up button below. It would really help the YouTube algorithm spread my channel to other like-minded, high potential students like yourself, so that I can keep making these educational videos to help you and others to get top grades in literature. Thank you so much as ever for watching, and I will see you in the next video.